All right, let's jump straight into this explainer and unpack what is, honestly, one of history's absolute wildest paradoxes. We're going back to the early 15th century. It's a moment when two distinct fleets appeared on opposite ends of the Earth. Neither side could afford to ignore them, yet they were fundamentally almost absurdly different. Today, we're doing a comparative autopsy of Zheng He's treasure fleet and Portugal's Age of Discovery. And look, this isn't just some basic story about who had the bigger or better ships, it's a deep dive into the political economic narratives. We're going to look at the underlying social software, the institutional incentives and the actual rules of the game that secretly drive human history.
I mean, the sheer asymmetry in scale here is it's absurd. On one side, you've got the Ming dynasty launching an absolute maritime colossus. When Zheng He set sail in 1405, he commanded over 27,000 men. Just massive. On the flip side, we have Portugal, a tiny, tiny kingdom right on the edge of the Iberian Peninsula with a total population of maybe 1 million people. When Prince Henry the Navigator sent his explorers out into the unknown Atlantic, they went in crews of literally just a few dozen men.
We're talking about a literal behemoth, lifted by the full economic weight of an empire, directly contrasted against a tiny kingdom basically surviving on the margins. Zheng He's fleet had over 200 large and medium-sized vessels. The flagships stretched over 100 meters long. They represented the absolute industrial pinnacle of a centralized empire fully paid for by the state treasury. But Portugal's expeditions, just 2 or 3 small, agile caravels per voyage, barely funded by this really fragile coalition of the royal court, military orders, and heavily debt-laden merchant capital.
So, you really got to ask yourself, how does the logic of scale fail so completely when determining historical destiny? By every measurable metric of the 15th century, China absolutely should have been the one to conquer the oceans and kickstart an age of global discovery. Yet it was the vastly superior Chinese fleet that ultimately turned around, went home, and just sealed its gates shut. Meanwhile, a handful of modest, debt-funded Portuguese ships violently stitched the continents together. Why?
Section 1. Institutional engines. Prestige versus survival. To answer that question, we have to look under the hood, past the wood and the sails, and examine the actual engines driving these fleets. The incentive structures here are night and day. The Ming fleet, which was commissioned by the Yongle Emperor, was built entirely for political demonstration. It was this extravagant, massive show to project the prestige of the Celestial Empire. Portugal's core motive, on the other hand, was raw economic extraction. It was a blood-soaked survival gamble looking for gold, ivory, and breaking up monopolies. The Ming engaged in tribute trade, acting with immense imperial generosity. The Portuguese used armed commerce, building fortresses and monopolizing routes purely by force. So ultimately, you've got an empire purchasing peace at a massive expense versus a hungry pack of wolves chasing enormous returns just to fund their very next voyage.
Zheng He essentially established what we call the Pax Sinica. It was a vast, sprawling tributary system anchored by military deterrence, political investiture, and massive economic subsidies spanning all across Southeast Asia. The Ming enforced a strict maritime ban. What that meant was, if a foreign nation wanted Chinese silk or porcelain, they legally had to enter this official tributary network. It definitely brought order, but man, it came at a steep price.
The guiding philosophy was simple, but incredibly costly, giving generously, receiving modestly. The Ming system basically required the state to pay a massive premium just to maintain this hierarchical prestige. The rewards they bestowed on vassal states far, far exceeded the actual value of the tribute they received in return, so it became an entirely unsustainable fiscal burden. It wasn't an economic engine at all. It was more like a gigantic empire-funded charity meant to buy political submission.
Section 2. The Tamerlane Flank Hypothesis. Now, the official records claim Zheng He was just, looking for a missing emperor or showing off wealth. But macro-historical analysis points to something much darker and, frankly, way more urgent.
When you actually line up the events, a stunning historical coincidence emerges, one that official records conveniently glossed over. The real existential threat to China wasn't on the sea at all. It was the rising power of Tamerlane's empire over in Central Asia. In December 1404, Tamerlane marches 200,000 troops explicitly to destroy the Ming. In February 1405, he unexpectedly dies. But because overland routes were totally severed, the Ming were completely blind to this. Just 5 months later, in July 1405, the Ming emperor orders Zheng He's massive fleet to sail west.
With that overland intelligence corridor severed, launching a massive fleet to the southern edge of Tamerlane's empire was actually an incredibly rational defensive response.
Think about it. This was very likely humanity's first strategic naval flanking maneuver. They were sailing to places like Calicut and Hormuz, which were the exact southern economic lifelines of Tamerlane's empire.
And the evidence? It's right there in the payload. The overwhelming majority of Zheng He's crew weren't merchants, they were hardened military personnel. We're talking regular infantry, cavalry forces, archers, and even early firearms units, all loaded right onto these ships. The fleet was essentially an amphibious reserve force, perfectly capable of opening a second front at a moment's notice. Once the Ming finally realized Tamerlane was dead, that military purpose faded, and the whole thing devolved into the ceremonial tribute trade we talked about earlier.
Section 3. The Great Mist Alliance. Now, if we zoom out to the macro-historical chessboard, we find this deeply tragic geopolitical irony.
Both of these empires were essentially trying to solve the exact same geopolitical headache. The Ming were suffocating under the threat of Tamerlane, a massive Turkic land power. Meanwhile, Portugal was suffocating under the monopoly of the Ottoman Empire, another Turkic land power that was completely blocking their access to Eastern markets. In fact, Tamerlane had recently crushed the Ottomans at the Battle of Ankara. So, the Ming and the Portuguese actually shared a profound mutual interest in bypassing these restrictive overland monopolies.
But the core tragedy here is one of time. The irony of geography is that there were two potential allies sharing a common enemy, but they were separated by an entire century. By the time Portugal finally navigated all the way around Africa and reached the edge of the Ming tributary world, Tamerlane was long dead. The Ming had completely forgotten their strategic vigilance. So the Portuguese arrived expecting to do armed commerce, and a clash between these two completely mismatched systems was basically inevitable.
Section 4. The 1521 collision at Tunmen. And this brings us to the dramatic flashpoint, where these two totally contrasting systems finally meet in blood and fire.
The situation deteriorated incredibly fast. In 1511, Portugal violently captures Malacca, which was a core forward base of the Ming's tributary network. The exiled king of Malacca literally begs Beijing for help. Then, in 1517, the Portuguese send an envoy, Tomé Pires, to Beijing. But he completely misreads the room. He treats the emperor as an equal, totally ignoring the mandatory vassal protocol. The Ming are, understandably, furious. They order the expulsion of these lawless bandits, and by 1521, the first regular naval war between East and West erupts at Tunmen.
The Portuguese roll up with these superior, breech-loading Folangji cannons and super-durable caravel warships, but the Ming commander, Wang Hong, he delivered an absolute tactical masterclass. Instead of engaging the superior Western firepower head-on, he used espionage. He bribed Chinese technicians working on the Portuguese ships to steal the cannon designs outright. Then he exploited the shallow draft of his own ships, waited for calm winds when those heavy Portuguese sails were useless, and launched coordinated wolf-pack fire ship attacks.
The Portuguese suffered a crushing defeat. They literally had to flee into the night. But the aftermath is where the popular historical narrative usually gets things completely backwards. The Ming didn't immediately retreat into fearful isolation. Actually, scratch that. It was the exact opposite. They launched what might be history's first massive military reverse engineering program. They took those stolen cannon designs and kicked off the mass production of Folangji muskets. These became core weapons for their land defense against the Mongols and Manchus. The profound irony is that the foreigners who could have been allies ended up leaving their advanced firearms tech behind through a violent backdoor.
Section 5. Social Software and Destiny. All right, let's look at the ultimate legacy of these two fleets.
This right here is the ultimate divergence. The Ming choice was fundamentally that of an agrarian civilization. They could establish order, sure, but they completely lacked the fiscal motivation and the institutional engine for sustained expansion. It was a rigid hierarchy that just dissolved under its own fiscal strain. The Portuguese choice, however, represented the messy dawn of a new modern world system. They had a self-sustaining engine of early capitalism, where the profits of every single voyage paid for the next one.
And that strict agrarian logic ultimately led to a devastating decree from the Ming court: not a single plank shall sail to sea. Faced with internal financial strain and severe northern threats, China didn't just quietly stop exploring. They burned their navigational archives. Decades of unparalleled shipbuilding expertise and navigational knowledge just vanished. Poof, they completely missed their ticket into the coming age of global maritime dominance.
So the big takeaway from this explainer is crystal clear. Technological scale, on its own, absolutely does not guarantee historical success. It wasn't the size of those 100-meter treasure ships that actually mattered. It was the underlying social software, the economic, political, and institutional incentives propelling them, that ultimately dictated the destiny of these societies.
Which brings us to a final thought. If a fleet of over 200 massive, state-of-the-art ships can just be erased from the oceans by bad institutional software, while 3 tiny boats can literally change the globe through relentless capital reinvestment, well, it leaves us to wonder. As we look at modern superpowers competing right now, possessing vast technological scales, which one actually has the social software to survive the future? What invisible institutional engines are secretly driving our world's destiny today? Think about that for a bit, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.